Hello, my name is Keith Martin. Welcome to this CAFII webinar on FSRA's Consumer Office. We're just waiting for a few more attendees to join. We'll start in a few moments. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this fifth CAFII webinar of 2023, with our focus in this session being the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario's Consumer Office. My name is Keith Martin, and I am Co-Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Financial Institutions in Insurance, or CAFII. On behalf of myself and my Co-Executive Director colleague, Brendan Wicks, and the CAFII Board of Directors, thank you for joining our webinar today. I would also like to welcome to today's webinar CAFII's two new staff members, Shanae Smith, Operations Manager, and Robin Jennings, Research Analyst, who have joined the CAFII team in preparation for Brendan's retirement at the end of this year. Welcome, Shanae, and welcome, Robin. CAFII is a not-for-profit association dedicated to the development of an open and flexible insurance marketplace. Our 15 members include the insurance arms of Canada's major banks and credit unions, along with their insurer partners, which underwrite credit protection insurance and travel insurance. This is another in our webinar series with key regulators, policymakers, and other experts and thought leaders in the insurance sector and on related societal issues. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the topic that we will be discussing today is FSRA's Consumer Office. We are very fortunate to be joined today by Glenn Patiseri, Executive Vice President, Policy and Chief Consumer Officer and Acting EVP, Auto Insurance Products at the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, or FSRA, and by Stuart Wilkinson, FSRA's Chief Consumer Officer. Now, for today's webinar, Glenn will start us off with introductory comments on his vision for the Consumer Office, followed by Stuart, who will engage in a fireside chat with me about the Consumer Office that he heads up. As Executive Vice President, Policy and Chief Consumer Officer, and Acting EVP, Auto Insurance Products at FSRA, Glenn is responsible for working across core regulatory areas to develop rules regulating the following sectors: property and casualty insurance, including auto insurance rates, life and health insurance, credit unions and caisse populaire, mortgage brokers, health service providers who are related to the auto insurance sector, pension plans, and financial advisors and planners. In addition to leading FSRA's strategic policy function, Glenn also has responsibility for the Innovation Office and the Consumer Office roles within the organization. Glenn has spent over 20 years within the public sector with extensive policy, program design, and consumer protection experience, most recently as Assistant Deputy Minister of Consumer Protection with Ontario's Ministry of Government and Consumer Services. Glenn's colleague, Stuart Wilkinson, has spent over a decade working in public policy with a focus on financial services regulation in Ontario. He has held a number of different roles at FSRA, including Senior Manager of Strategic Policy on the authority's pre-launch transition team, Director of Auto P&C Insurance Policy after FSRA launched, and most recently as Chief Consumer Officer. And as Chief Consumer Officer, Stuart is responsible for leading FSRA's Consumer Office. The Consumer Office is responsible for amplifying the voice of the consumer inside and outside of FSRA, building and applying foundational frameworks and processes to guide FSRA and helping FSRA identify and address cross-cutting opportunities and problems. Before joining FSRA, Stuart worked in the P&C insurance industry and at the Ontario Ministry of Finance, where he provided advice to the government on financial services regulation, including reforms to the province's auto insurance system and the government's response to the expert panel that originally recommended the creation of FSRA. So we indeed are very fortunate to have two such experienced and expert individuals contributing to our webinar today. Thank you both. By way of an operational announcement, members of the audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask during the webinar, please send them to me as the host using the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will pose them on your behalf. Unless you specifically request in your question to be identified as its source, I will pose all questions on an anonymous basis. And just before we get the webinar underway, I want to extend a special welcome to a number of VIP guest attendees. in addition to many representatives from our 15 CAFII member companies and our 9 associates, which are key supplier companies to the bancassurance sector, we have VIP attendees today from allied industry associations, such as the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association, or CLHIA, the Travel Health Insurance Association, or THIA, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, or IBC, and as well from a number of insurance and financial services regulatory and policymaking authorities, including the following: the British Columbia Financial Services Authority, or BCFSA, the Insurance Council of British Columbia, the Alberta Treasury Board and Finance, or ATBF, the Alberta Insurance Council, or AIC, the Alberta Auto Insurance Rate Board, the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority of Saskatchewan, or FCAA, of course, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, FSRA, Quebec's Autorité des Marchés Financiers, or the AMF, the Financial and Consumer Services Commission of New Brunswick, or FCNB, and the Ombuds Service for Life and Health Insurance, or OLI. Welcome to you all. Well, let's get started with Glenn. And Glenn, could you tell us about your vision for the Consumer Office?
Thanks, Keith. And yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you again for the kind introduction. Brendan also wanted to express my congratulations on your impending retirement. And just a quick update, Stuart Wilkinson is actually our Chief Consumer Officer. So I think it's my bio is needing to be updated. But I'm pleased to be here to showcase the progression of our work at FSRA, and in particular, our Consumer Office. I thought I'd spend a few minutes trying to give some history and the vision on the creation of both the policy and the Consumer Office functions at FSRA. So most of you will know FSRA started in 2019 based on the expert panel report recommendations. One of the recommendations from the panel included the creation of a standalone Consumer Office to act as a challenge function to the organization in all of its work, whether through the development of our rules, guidance, or prioritization of our supervision activities, or consumer outreach and education. We never ended up following that model, and for good reason. I'm a student of user-centered design thinking, where you focus on the end user when designing your programs and services. So when you look at the design more strategically, the question was, why focus on challenging the organization after it has done its thinking? You could be or should be focused on designing with the consumer at the core of its work and getting real insights rather than trying to act as a proxy. So fast forward, the Consumer Office is embedded in the policy function at FSRA, and the policy function has a few key responsibilities: leading the strategy, policy, rulemaking, and guidance processes, responsibility for regulatory harmonization initiatives, focusing on national standards versus subnational approaches to regulatory activity, responsibility of the Innovation Office, and the Consumer Office, led by our Chief Consumer Officer, Stuart Wilkinson. So just want to talk a little bit about the Consumer Office. It plays a vital role in the policy team by amplifying the voice of the consumer, both inside and outside of FSRA. Stuart will elaborate on his vision for the office, but let me highlight some of the amazing successes so far. First, the creation of our standing consumer advisory panel, who provides insights and input to FSRA on all of our regulatory activities. One highlight is how instrumental the panel was in helping FSRA design the new title protection framework for financial advisors and planners that we launched last year. Their input, along with the sector's input, mattered, and we took a number of their design recommendations into the final framework. The creation of a research on consumer insights. This will allow us to set out baseline consumer perspectives to help guide our work and provide an effective measurement tool. Stuart will undoubtedly expand on the consumer research work underway and planned. One quick example of that is FSRA conducted research to support its participation in national projects with the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators and the Canadian Insurance Regulatory Organization related to insurance compensation arrangements, including the incentive management guidance and the discussion paper on upfront compensation for seg funds. Findings from the research provided insights on how consumers prefer to pay for financial advice. Also, working with government, we're proud of the ability to retain any monetary penalties and use them to advance consumer outreach and education initiatives. We will be excited to launch this shortly, so stay tuned from Stuart and our public announcement. FSRA's first ever strategic framework, which was actually created last year. The strategic framework helps cement the strategic pillars of the organization and help us build on our foundations as a consumer protection organization which is partly enabled through partnerships with industry. I highlight this because it's a noteworthy achievement at an organizational level that helped us further along our maturity model. Last year, a decision was made to integrate the strategy function, which is responsible for the overall strategy and development of our strategic priorities, with the consumer office to further reflect the organizational mindset of the work the consumer office drives towards regulatory activities and vice versa. And Stuart is the first ever Chief Consumer Officer responsible for both the strategic policy and consumer office activities. Finally, and most importantly, transparency is key. The Consumer Office is prioritizing publishing its research in order to build public awareness on key consumer issues. And just like our partnership with CAFII today, we are looking for ways to share and promote our learning with industry and other regulatory partners. I'd like to take an opportunity to thank you for inviting FSRA, and I'd like to pass it over to my colleagues, Stuart Wilkinson and Keith Martin, to begin their fireside chat. And for fun, I strongly encourage you to ask Stuart some really tough questions.
Thank you, Glenn. That was much appreciated. Thank you. So Stuart, let's jump right in. I'm going to ask you the most basic question I could ask. Why was the Consumer Office developed?
Thanks very much, Keith. And it's great to be here. The last time Glenn and I were doing a joint presentation, we had 15 minutes allocated, and Glenn took up 14 minutes and 30 seconds. So got a bit more room here, which is exciting and a bit scary. So why was the Consumer Office developed? Glenn talked a bit about the genesis for the Consumer Office, going back to the genesis of FSRA, and the expert panel that recommended the creation of FSRA also recommended the creation of the Consumer Office. They called it the Office of the Consumer at the time. So we've made our title more concise. That recommendation, I think at its core, was about a gap that the panel observed in the financial services industry in Ontario related to the voice of the consumer. There just were not, and still are not, very many organizations with the resources and the time and expertise required to engage meaningfully in dialogues about regulatory policy and financial services in Ontario. And the panel's view was that in order to fill that gap, the regulator should have this function that acts as a voice of consumers. And I think the panel held that view because of its observations and its consultations and what it saw in the input that it was getting about the regulatory landscape in Ontario. And also held that view because it could look down the street at the Ontario Securities Commission, which had a Office of the Investor, which is now the Investor Office. So GAP observed there's a successful model already out there, and the panel made its recommendation, and that's where things start. And like Glenn said, FSRA took a slightly different spin on what the Consumer Office was actually meant to accomplish, but certainly the core rationale for why it exists, which is to fill in that potential gap and make sure consumer voices are at the center of FSRA's decision making, that still persists to this day, and that's at the center of all of our thinking.
Okay, that was a very excellent overview, Stuart. Thank you. And this might be a good moment to launch a poll to see what level of awareness there is among attendees today of the Consumer Office. So I'm going to ask you to just answer these two questions. One is about whether you are familiar with FSRA's Consumer Office, and you can either choose very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not at all familiar. And then as well, there's three components to the Consumer Office: consumer focus, strategic foundations, and policy leadership. And the second question is, and Stuart will be touching on this later in his conversation with me, but we'd like to know which you think would be the most important to you in your work. So we'll just wait a few moments and see what is the perception of people. Okay, I'm going to share the results now, and I hope you can see them. So 12% are very familiar, 72%, Stuart, are somewhat familiar. So, nearly 85% have some knowledge about the consumer office, quite a good result, and only 16% are not familiar at all. And then in terms of your three components that you're going to be talking about later, consumer focus is overwhelmingly the most important to people in their work. So those are interesting results. Stuart, does that surprise you?
It surprises me in a positive way that we had so few not at all familiar entries. I think that's fantastic, and the very familiar entries. I don't think my mom and dad are on the call, so I'm not sure who that was, but that's great to see as well. But it's exciting to see that there's at least some level of familiarity amongst the audience with our work, and consumer focus, which I think of as amplifying the voice of the consumers. That's my bumper sticker phrase for that part of our purpose. It's great to see the interest in that work, and I'm really excited to talk about that. I think that's kind of our default setting when we think about the consumer office. That's just from our name alone. That's what people are going to associate most closely with our work. We do really exciting stuff on cross-cutting policy issues and strategic direction of the organization as well. So I'll touch on that, but I'll make a little note in the back of my mind that consumer focus is what folks are most interested in.
Excellent. Well, tell us a little bit about something more along the nitty-gritty side, which is, how is this office funded?
So consumer office is a part of FSRA, and we're funded like any other part of FSRA in that the money comes from fees and assessments that FSRA sets through its rulemaking authority and then collects from the regulated sectors. So no different from anybody else in our policy group or public affairs team or what have you. FSRA generally categorizes costs it incurs into direct costs that are specifically attributed to the different a particular sector that we regulate, and common costs, which aren't directly attributed to the sectors but are portioned out based on a prorated share that each sector bears of the common costs. So consumer office generally lands in that common cost bucket. We've done some work to try and make our cost allocation more direct, and found that the vast majority of our work is cross-sectoral in nature, and therefore better defined as a common cost. So we are part of FSRA like anybody else, but a really important feature of FSRA is that ability to fund its operations independent of the government budgeting process. That was a key observation made by the expert panel that recommended our creation way back when. And one bonus comment, I think Glenn alluded to this already, but FSRA does have the authority to take administrative monetary penalties or other proceeds from enforcement action and set those aside and spend those on, for example, consumer research or consumer education initiatives. We haven't launched that process yet. We're hoping to do that in the fall, and that is meant for extra stuff that FSRA wouldn't typically fund out of its operational budget. So the consumer office, as a part of FSRA, doesn't draw its funding from the proceeds of enforcement, and those will be used for other purposes.
Okay, excellent. Now we talked about in the poll some of the structure that your consumer office has, and maybe you could elaborate on that. Tell us a bit about its objectives and how it's structured.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I feel like I got scooped a little bit, but the big three components of our purpose, you mentioned, Keith, and Glenn reiterated them. So when I was practicing for this, it felt like I was repeating these things a lot, and we're well on our way to hitting that mark. So three components of our purpose, and this reflects not the purpose envisioned by the expert panel, not the purpose of the consumer office when it launched, but the purpose of the consumer office today, which is an amalgamation of Consumer Office 1.0 and the enterprise-wide strategy function that has been incorporated into our group. So the three components of our purpose are consumer focus, which is amplifying the voice of the consumer inside and outside of FSRA. Strategic foundations, which is about creating processes and guidance that really helps the organization effectively deliver on its mandate top to bottom. So from setting our overall strategic direction through the strategic framework that Glenn mentioned, all the way down to how do we create a repeatable process for FSRA to exercise its rulemaking authority or create a piece of guidance, because we don't want to be reinventing the wheel every time we try to do one of those things. And then the final component of our purpose is policy leadership. And I think of that as a kind of basket clause that enables us to dedicate some time to, in addition to amplifying the voice of the consumer and thinking about the strategic foundations required for the organization to be successful, actually take a deeper dive into cross-cutting policy issues affecting consumers, not isolated to one of FSRA's regulated sectors, but across the board. So recently, things on our minds have been complaints handling or management of information technology risk. And you can kind of think of a really long list of emerging trends that matter to consumers, regardless of whether they're a pension plan member, or a credit union member, or an insurance policy holder, or receiving financial advice from a financial planner. So we need to prioritize in that category, and I think we do an effective job of that, but we're trying to find opportunities for FSRA to take a position on a given matter. So three objectives for us: consumer focus, strategic foundations, and policy leadership. That really defines our work.
And some of the strategic elements, Stuart, does that come from internal investigations, or do you work with outside bodies like consultants or research firms to get some of that information? How do you sort of form your positions on these matters?
Yeah, so I'll answer that from two different perspectives. When we're thinking about this, the organization's strategy, we want to start with an internal discussion and engage with our board of directors, engage with our senior leadership, and figure out what the right course for FSRA looks like. And then every year, FSRA engages in a public consultation on its statement of priorities, which maps out what we want to prioritize, the new things that we want to work on in the next fiscal year. So you're actually going to see our statement of priorities for next year come out for public consultation in October. And that will be an opportunity for us to engage meaningfully with stakeholders in the public interest community about where FSRA is headed. So we always want to take external input on the strategic direction of the organization. And then when it comes to developing positions on a specific policy issue, let's say it's related to the emerging applications of artificial intelligence and how regulated entities serve financial services consumers. FSRA, a lot of really smart people work at FSRA. It's a fairly big organization. We've got a lot of great knowledge and experience here, but we certainly don't have a monopoly on knowing everything about emerging trends and issues. So we're always going to want to get out there and speak to other people and get their perspectives, be they consumer perspectives or stakeholder perspectives, regulated entities that are serving consumers, to better understand an issue before we come to a position on it. Or I should probably reframe that to better understand the issue, period. We're not in the business of going out and trying to solve problems that don't exist. So our first step is always defining that issue and making sure that it's worth FSRA prioritizing with our scarce resources.
Okay, excellent. And I do have a question from the audience, and it relates to AMPs, or administrative monetary penalties. And you indicated that there are some extra things that may be funded by those penalties. And the question is, what could you elaborate on that and tell us what some of those things might be?
Yeah, this is where I need my, that big, thick book of the Consolidated Insurance Statutes of Canada, and I flip to the right page and answer that question definitively. But instead, I'll just provide a general response, which is that the FSRA Act in Ontario, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario Act, has a regulation made under it. And I don't have the number of the regulation offhand, but the regulation outlines exactly what those extra things are. And they're things like initiatives to further consumer education, initiatives to fund research that helps FSRA better understand the sectors that it regulates. So those are the types of things that the money is set aside for. It's a very similar regime to what exists already under the Ontario Securities Act for the Ontario Securities Commission, although that is being changed to broaden or potentially broaden. The government is consulting right now on broadening the purposes for which the OSC can use proceeds of enforcement.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that, Stuart. I do have another question from the audience, and it's about complaints. So the question is, how does your office handle a complaint from a consumer, potentially against a financial advisor, a planner, or even an insurance agent? Do you handle any of those complaints or investigate them at all in your office, or are they referred to another department?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And for the previous question, Keith, I can supply you with the link to the regulation under the FSRA Act afterwards.
Yeah, no, I'll just jump in, Stuart, and let attendees know that you have provided me with some very helpful links. And what we're going to do is, when we post this webinar on our CAFII website, we'll include the links right then and there. So anybody who would like to investigate further or see some of those sources of information, it will be readily available in the section of our website where this recording will be posted.
Fantastic. It's like podcast notes. That's great.
Yes.
So the question is about complaints. And it's identifying a gap in how I answered your question about our objectives, because it's very important to talk about what we do, and also very important to talk about what we don't do. And if a complaint comes to me or somebody from our team, that's going to be referred to FSRA's complaints intake function. So we have a contact center that deals with inquiries and complaints from members of the public, and those, when something escalates to the level of a complaint, it goes through a set process within FSRA that doesn't involve the consumer office. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. It's something that the expert panel spoke to in their report. The consumer office is not here to adjudicate individual issues or resolve specific complaints. There's another function within FSRA for that. We'll take a policy view related to complaint handling, and I'm in touch with our colleagues across FSRA about how we approach that function and what leading practices are in other jurisdictions that we could be looking at. But we're not going to be in the business of resolving individual complaints, and we're not in the business of executing on consumer education campaigns either. You're not going to find us figuring out tactics for how to best reach consumers on social media. Again, we might be involved in discussions around the strategy related to that, but we have a lot of communications expertise at FSRA that is responsible for that sort of thing. So I should have gotten across those two items that folks might think a consumer office is responsible for that actually exist outside of our mandate. So I hope that's responsive to the question.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I do want to dig a little deeper into the research function and the strategy function that you mentioned, Stuart. And I'm thinking of some of the consumer issues that we read about. So privacy, the use of people's personal data, the increasing impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning in terms of underlying trends and how that could affect consumers. Are those sort of examples of thematic issues that you might be looking at? And are there others that come to mind that you think could be on your priority list?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the second question first. Other stuff that's on the list of things we're at least monitoring, if not actively developing a FSRA position on. I think IT risk management is on very much part of that list, and something we are actively working on, and is linked to some of the things that you mentioned, Keith. I think climate change is something that you talked about at the last webinar, and a very prominent issue that's obviously top of mind across the sectors that FSRA regulates. And the number one thing for consumers right now is economic volatility and the cost of living. So that's obviously top of mind for FSRA as well. So you mentioned privacy, data, artificial intelligence, and yes to all of those, tracking in different ways, not necessarily tracking towards creating new guidance or new consultations for industry to participate in with us. But certainly those are things that we see popping up constantly in the international forums we engage in our environmental scanning, and in consultations with the public interest community. Our consumer advisory panel, for example, has been very interested in privacy and specific implications of digitalization of financial services. So there's a lot to track there, and we're trying to keep an eye on it. I don't think we have anything in particular or any coming attractions on those items that I can preview at this time, though.
All right, well, we look forward to seeing some of that when it is done. It will be made public in most cases, Stuart?
We want our default setting to be making stuff public. So whether that's FSRA's strategic direction through the strategic framework and statement of priorities, or the results of our research, unless there's a good reason for FSRA to keep something limited to the 600 people that work at FSRA, we want to expand the audience for that and engage with people, and hopefully provide some information that's helpful to folks. So I can't say for sure if anything's going to be public, because we have to evaluate things on a case-by-case basis. But we really want to emphasize the importance of transparency, and I think that will add value to financial services sector overall. And we see other regulators like the Ontario Securities Commission or the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada that are ahead of us, quite frankly, right now in making their research more available to the public. So we're trying to catch up. And I think we'll be there pretty quickly.
Well, CAFII will certainly be supportive of that, because we do believe that when we have that foundation for a dialogue, it's helpful to both the regulator and the regulated entities. Stuart, we've talked a little bit about some of your future plans and some of the foundational things that you're building, but there's also a lot that has been done. Tell us about the achievements to date of the office, and just bring us up to speed on where things stand.
Absolutely. So, and I'll try to be as concise as possible. I get very excited talking about what we've been up to. Under the consumer focus component of our purpose, which folks have said is what most interests them or is most applicable to their work. I think Glenn hit the nail on the head in his remarks. The two big things to highlight are the success of our consumer advisory panel, which is a tangible thing that FSRA has done to help fill in that gap that the expert panel observed when it comes to consumer voices shaping direction in financial services regulation in Ontario. So consumer advisory panel, I think, is a great accomplishment, and I'll talk more about that. And the research that we've been doing, which has gone from a relatively opaque and ad hoc function just starting out, which was like what we had to be doing, to a more mature, consistent research agenda where we are publishing summaries of our work and how we're going to apply key findings on a regular basis. So to me, those are the two headlines for what we've accomplished under the consumer focus banner. And for the consumer advisory panel, and Glenn talked about their influence over the financial planner, financial advisor title protection framework, which was great, and they put a lot of work into that. And the panel is now in its 4th year of operation. It consists of 13 members. We do a call for membership every year, so there's kind of a rolling, some people come in, some people come out thing to keep the panel fresh. And under the leadership of the chair, Laura Tamblin-Watts, the panel has become very active in influencing FSRA's direction. They've provided I think 4 written submissions to us this year. They've met with our board. They have created a new type of meeting that they call the Policy Lab to talk about ideas in their infancy. They are trying to organize a meetup of consumer advocates to expand their network. So they've become a really active, engaged group. And I think that's all to the benefit of consumers in Ontario. So I'm really excited about working with them and the progress that they've made and their commitment to protecting the rights and interests of consumers ultimately. On the research side, the first report that we published with consumer survey research results was back in December 2022. We did a cross-sector look at consumer attitudes, experiences, and preferences. So that relates to all the sectors FSRA regulates: pensions, credit unions, mortgage brokers, insurance, the whole kit and caboodle. And got some really interesting findings, particularly about how vulnerable consumers experience our regulated sectors relative to consumers with a more normative profile. And there's a lot of other good stuff in that report. That'll be part of the notes that go out to folks afterward. And if you haven't already, I'd encourage everyone to just flip through the executive summary report. I think it's like 40 pages or something. It's not too bad. And there is some really interesting stuff there. But the vulnerable consumer experience information that we got back was really consistent across all the regulated sectors, and I think made us or confirmed to us what you would intuitively think, and provided a little more evidence to encourage us to take a closer look at how to strengthen protection of vulnerable consumers. So I'm really excited about how we've started to apply the research findings, and that includes policy work related to vulnerable consumers, but it also includes supervisory work. Like we've started to see supervision plans for different sectors incorporate results from our surveys to make sure that they're prioritizing the right things when they're working with our regulated entities. So very excited about how that feedback loop is shaping up.
And just touching on the points you made about the consumer advisory panel, just a few practical questions, Stuart. How large is it? How do people get appointed? How long are they appointed for? How often do they meet? And how how do they sort of form conclusions and share those within FSRA?
I think I can answer all those questions. So the Consumer Advisory Panel consists right now of 13 members. Members are appointed for a 2-year term with the option to extend for another year with mutual agreement from the member and FSRA. And of course, nobody's beholden to FSRA, and FSRA is not beholden to anybody. This is a creation of FSRA, so people can leave when they want, and if things aren't working out, FSRA can ask somebody to leave as well. So that's where there's some regular turnover amongst the members, because somebody's term is always expiring, and that's why every year in the fall, FSRA puts out a call for applications for membership in the panel. So we conduct that process as transparently as possible to make sure that anybody from the public can apply to be a member of the panel. We take those applications back, take a look at them against where the panel might need more skills and experience. People on the panel can either be subject matter experts with a long history in one of the sectors or many of the sectors that FSRA regulates, or they can be process experts that understand either just the consumer perspective. They're consumers and they understand and can articulate that, or they're experts in things like dispute resolution, for example, and can apply that to the CAP's work. So we try to get a broad array of experiences into that room and around that table. We're not trying to build a massive panel, so it's not going to be truly representative of Ontarians with 12 spots, 13 spots around the table, but we do our best. And then the panel meets, they follow a tiered engagement model. So they think of their work as like a funnel. And at the top of the funnel, I mentioned the policy lab. So that's ideas at their very start, where the CAP can engage with FSRA and try to work with us before the cement is poured, if you will. And then in the middle of that funnel, there are topic-specific working groups that the CAP creates. And that's really where they put in the work required to develop a CAP position on a particular issue. They have 6, I believe, topic-specific working groups running at the moment. And then at the very narrow end of the funnel, they have general meetings. And I think there are 4 or 5 of those a year. Those are more structured in nature. The working groups report back to the panel members on their progress. And those are, the agenda is a little more structured and involves items that might have very broad appeal across all of the CAP members. So that's generally how it works. It's evolved over time, so it's always changing. We're always adding new features or trying new things out to make sure we have the most constructive dialogues possible with the members. So Keith, I hope I didn't leave anything out, but that was my 5-minute overview of how the CAP works.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and perhaps I'll ask you to elaborate on a side element, which is, something I've certainly seen in media and other outlets, that protecting and promoting consumer interests can be very challenging because, unlike, for example, industry, which is organized and focused, consumers are dispersed, they're not organized, they have a variety of different perspectives, and they're not funded to sort of pursue their perspective. So certainly government, regulators, your consumer advisory panel are all laudable initiatives to try to address that. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on some of the challenges and some of the opportunities to try to give consumers that voice that otherwise they don't naturally have.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Keith. So FSRA regulates big, important sectors. We license mortgage brokers that arrange about $200 billion in mortgages every year in Ontario. We oversee pension plans that have $800 billion in assets total. insurance protection offered to consumers in Ontario. I don't think anybody can put a dollar sign on that. It's like incomprehensible how much insurance protection Ontarians have as policyholders. So these are big sectors that serve people at really important times in their life, or in their day-to-day lives. So in insurance, for example, you're serving somebody who's making a claim, they've suffered a loss, and they're in a tough spot, and that's when the insurance companies, the insurance contract comes into play, right? So the entities that we regulate serve consumers at really important times in their lives. So for that reason, it's, I think, very important to take a consumer-centric approach, and the entities that we regulate, I believe, take a consumer-centric approach already in their work. And in many ways, FSRA is probably catching up to those entities and trying to build up its capacity to listen to consumers and understand their experience. And we're obviously doing it from a slightly different position as a regulator with a mandate handed to us by the government, as opposed to an insurance company or credit union or pension plan structure. So we're coming at it from a slightly different angle. But I think what you touched on is really important, that we can't be successful if we're treating consumers as one homogenous group. And what we see more and more is regulators doing some segmentation so that they can protect consumers, but specifically focus on where consumers are at the highest risk of harm, and find those vulnerable consumers and do things to help them out. And we see in Canada, the Canadian Securities Administrators has taken steps in that direction. In the UK, we've seen the Financial Conduct Authority issue guidance specific to vulnerable consumer protection. We see that in other international settings as well. So I think that's really a key point or a key opportunity for us in our vision of financial safety, fairness, and choice for Ontarians, is to take a consumer-focused approach and go beyond that to think about where are the consumers that most need our help, and focus on them.
Yeah, and I think it's probably reassuring for you, given your consumer focus, that at least in insurance, one protection for consumers is that the relationship is entirely and totally based on trust. And so it's a promise, and the insurance company has to be there when that incident occurs that puts a consumer at risk. So that is a positive, in the sense that there's an alignment between what you want for the consumer and what the industry is sort of basing its business model on.
Absolutely, and I saw comments, I think, along those lines about the utmost good faith duty from the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK when they're implementing their new consumer duty, which imposes a high standard on regulated entities. But the point is, there's really strong alignment between all parties, and it may seem like a high standard at first, but it may result in unwinding a lot of burden and a lot of prescriptive rules that have been put in place to get at the kind of outcomes that the regulator wants to see, but hasn't really been focused on, because we've been more focused on means-based standards in the meantime. So thank you for that point, Keith. I think that's exactly right.
Stuart, I'm going to talk about our CAFII members now for a moment, and ask you about the impact of your office on them, and what are some of the things they should be expecting, and maybe you could just speak a little bit about that direct sort of implication for them.
Yeah, and sorry, I am losing my voice a little bit, but I think generally the key takeaway I'd like CAFII members to have from this conversation is that there is alignment between them and FSRA when it comes to operating in a consumer-centric or customer-centric way. And would expect that we are behind where your members are in terms of understanding their customers and designing services and products that meet those customers' needs. But we're catching up, and we really want to make that the focal point of our work in the consumer office. So I think that general alignment is really important to take away. And then I would love some of those somewhat familiar scores in the poll at the start to move into very familiar at some point. And I think that the best way to do that is keep track of things that the consumer office is doing, particularly the research that we're putting out. And you'll see us put out research in the fall, put out a report on a consumer survey we did related to financial advice. And Glenn mentioned it, specific to upfront compensation in segregated funds contracts. So there's a lot of interesting content there, and we benefit greatly from getting more eyes on that, so we can get then some feedback and input from the experts in the industry on what we should be looking at more closely. And so I think it can be a bit of a really positive feedback loop where we're putting out our findings, industries giving us some pointers on maybe what we should be doing better to listen more effectively to consumers. And then our findings can actually help inform where industry is going, or how you all are trying to best serve your customers.
And let's just pick up on that, Stuart. You've talked about a few things that you're looking at in the foreseeable future. Tell us a bit about your plans for 23 and 24 and beyond.
Okay, and FSRA's statement of priorities for next fiscal year is going to come out for public consultation in the fall. So that's a great place to look for FSRA's priorities for next year. For the consumer office, a lot of the topics we've been talking about are what's front and center for us. Launching that program to make use of proceeds of enforcement that we retain, for example, or continuing to execute on our research agenda and publish our findings, looking into some of those cross-cutting policy issues like finishing our guidance on IT risk management, or thinking more about how complaints are handled in the sectors that FSRA regulates. So lots of what we've already talked about will continue to be on our mind. And the one thing I wanted to really emphasize today was that piece about vulnerable consumers that I was speaking about earlier. That's an area where I don't think anybody has a magic wand or a silver bullet to solve the issue at hand, which is that vulnerable consumers have consistently worse outcomes than the consumers with a normative profile. And that means that we need to do a lot of engagement with the public interest community and with industry stakeholders to figure out where there are opportunities to bring those experiences of those vulnerable consumers more in line with what we would expect for them. So if there's one thing that folks want to check out or engage in after this discussion, I really hope it would be that work related to vulnerability, which hopefully will be moving into a consultation phase in the fall or the winter.
Look forward to participating in that. That's certainly a preoccupation of CAFII's. I can tell you that some research that we've reviewed from a insurance research organization called LIMRA indicates that 50% of Canadians are uninsured or underinsured. And their research also indicates that that percentage increases in lower income strata. So those Canadians who are at less wealthy are potentially the ones that are most vulnerable from an insurance and life insurance perspective. So that definitely is research that will be of great interest to our members, Stuart.
Thank you for that, Keith.
I want to ask you about an environmental stand. And what I'm getting at here, Stuart, is so FSRA has its consumer office. How does that relate to other jurisdictions and provinces in Canada? You're not the only one. Who else has sort of moved in this direction? And internationally, have you done any work in terms of what the international best practice players are, and where does sort of your office relate in terms of what other jurisdictions internationally are doing?
Yeah, so we always are looking to steal good ideas from other jurisdictions. When it comes to the consumer advisory panel and its structure, its terms of reference, we're always looking at other groups in Canada or internationally to figure out what might help us work more effectively. Same thing with our research agenda or how we do our strategic planning, or the issues we're trying to look into as cross-cutting policy issues. Absolutely, always looking into what other jurisdictions are doing. There's no reason that Ontario has to reinvent the wheel every time something comes up or we have a bright idea. The consumer office as a function, I think, is pretty unique amongst our colleague regulators, which isn't to say that they don't have a consumer or an investor function. A lot do. I mentioned the Ontario Securities Commission already, but given FSRA's unique mandate and unique mix of regulated sectors, it's difficult to find a true apples to apples comparison. But we're very interested in reaching out across Canada and building relationships and cooperating and collaborating with other regulators. That's part of FSRA's statutory mandate. So it's very important to do, and also finding opportunities to work with folks internationally as well and learn from them.
Excellent. Well, this hour's just flown by, Stuart. You're a font of knowledge. It's been really insightful and interesting, and it's clear to me that FSRA's consumer office is in very strong leadership hands. I really appreciate your time with us. I'm going to end the webinar by asking for your final thoughts before we close off.
Good luck to Brendan. It's been really great working with Brendan, and I'm sure we'll get to see each other again, but he's always been such a welcoming and inclusive leader and a great face of CAFII. So good luck in your retirement, Brendan. And Keith, I'm looking forward to working with you and Shanae and Robin in the future. We've got lots of great things to do together.
Agreed. Well, thank you for that, Stuart. That's a great way to end this webinar. To all the attendees, thank you very much for participating today. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website, along with some links that Stuart is going to provide. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.